What would you do if everyone you trusted turned against you? When Sofia Martinez walked into that hospital, she thought she was seeking help. Instead, she entered a trap so sophisticated that even she began doubting her sanity. This isn't just domestic violence. This is conspiracy reaching the highest levels of power, where psychiatric wards become prisons and wealthy men play God with women's lives. Hit like if you're ready for this psychological thriller, comment your predictions, and subscribe for more stories that challenge everything you believe. You won't see the ending coming. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the ballroom as Sofia Martinez adjusted her diamond necklace, the weight of it pressing against her throat like a gentle reminder of her gilded prison. 8 months pregnant and glowing under the warm lights, she smiled radiantly at the assembled crowd of Manhattan's elite. To everyone watching, she was the perfect billionaire's wife, carrying the perfect heir to a perfect fortune. "Ladies and gentlemen," James Whitmore III announced into the microphone, his voice carrying that practiced confidence that had built tech empires and conquered boardrooms. "Tonight, I'm honored to announce a $50 million donation to Children's Hospital of New York in honor of our miracle baby who will arrive next month." The applause thundered through the ballroom. Sofia felt James's hand settle possessively on her lower back, his fingers digging just slightly too hard into the silk fabric of her evening gown. To the cameras flashing around them, it looked like an affectionate gesture. She knew better. As the crowd surged forward with congratulations, Sofia caught her reflection in one of the gilt mirrors lining the wall. Designer makeup covered the fading bruise along her jawline perfectly. Professional styling had arranged her dark hair to hide the small bald patch where James had grabbed too hard last Tuesday. The custom Valentino gown draped elegantly over her pregnant form, concealing everything that mattered. "You're doing beautifully tonight, darling," James murmured in her ear as another couple approached to offer their praise. His breath was warm against her neck, but his words carried that familiar undertone that made her stomach clench. "Remember what we discussed about your answers regarding the nursery preparations?" She nodded, her practiced smile never wavering. "Of course, honey. Everything's perfect." But nothing was perfect. Nothing had been perfect for the 18 months since their wedding, when the charming courtship had transformed overnight into something else entirely. Something that wore the mask of love, but felt like ownership. The evening dragged on with forced conversations about baby names, nursery themes, and future plans. Sofia played her role flawlessly, the grateful wife basking in her husband's generosity and success. But beneath the performance, her mind was cataloging details. The way James's jaw tightened when Senator Morrison mentioned his upcoming committee hearing on tech industry regulations. The brief flash of something dangerous in his eyes when the hospital board chairman thanked them both personally. "I think it's time we headed home," James said finally, his hand finding that same spot on her back. "Sofia needs her rest. The baby's been quite active tonight." More lies wrapped in concern. The baby had been still for hours, which terrified her. But she'd learned not to mention such things to James. Her pregnancy belonged to him now, just like everything else in her life. As their driver held the door of the Bentley open, Sofia glimpsed her reflection once more in the car's tinted window. For just a moment, she saw past the designer facade to the woman trapped beneath. A trauma surgeon who had once saved lives in emergency rooms, reduced to a decorative object in someone else's perfect life. The drive home to their Fifth Avenue penthouse was silent except for the soft hum of the engine. James scrolled through his phone, already moving on to the next business crisis or social obligation. Sofia stared out at the city lights, each one representing someone with their own struggles and secrets. She thought about the woman she used to be, Dr. Sofia Martinez, who had worked her way through medical school on scholarships and determination. That woman had been fearless in operating rooms, confident in her abilities, respected by colleagues. Where had she gone? When had she allowed herself to disappear so completely into someone else's definition of perfection? The answer was complicated, woven through months of subtle manipulation that had started as overwhelming romance. James had pursued her relentlessly, showering her with attention, gifts, and promises of a life beyond her wildest dreams. He had seemed fascinated by her medical career, her intelligence, her independence. Only after the wedding did she realize his fascination was actually about conquering those very qualities. "Did you take your vitamins today?" James asked as they entered their penthouse, the question casual but loaded with expectation. Sophia nodded, though she had stopped taking the large white pills he provided weeks ago. Something about them made her feel foggy, disconnected from her own thoughts. She had started pretending to swallow them, then spitting them out later. It was a small rebellion, but it was hers. "Good girl," he said, kissing her forehead with what might have looked like affection to anyone watching. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we have the prenatal appointment with Dr. Kellerman." Dr. Kellerman, who asked no questions about bruises and accepted James's explanations about Sophia's clumsiness during pregnancy. Dr. Kellerman, whose practice had received a substantial donation from the Whitmore Foundation just before becoming Sophia's obstetrician. As James headed to his study for late-night business calls, Sophia climbed the marble staircase to their bedroom. She paused at the top, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, and whispered the words that had become her nightly prayer. "I'm going to find a way out of this, for both of us." The city glittered beyond their floor-to-ceiling windows, full of possibilities and freedoms that felt impossibly distant. But somewhere in that vast darkness, Sophia believed there had to be hope. There had to be a way back to the woman she used to be. She just had to survive long enough to find it. 3 weeks after the charity gala. Sophia stood in operating room 7 at Manhattan Presbyterian, her hands steady as she worked to repair a gunshot wound to a young man's chest. This was her sanctuary, the only place where James's influence couldn't reach her. Here, she was still Dr. Martinez, still valuable, still herself. "Pressure's dropping," announced the anesthesiologist, his voice tight with concern. Sophia adjusted her approach, her training taking over completely. "More suction. I can see the bleeding source." Her world narrowed to this moment, this patient, this chance to save a life. Everything else fell away. It was only when she stepped back from the successful surgery 2 hours later that she noticed the tremor in her hands. Not from surgical stress, but from something else entirely. Something that made her feel disconnected from her own body, as if she were watching herself from a distance. In the recovery room, as she filled out post-operative notes, the tremor worsened. The pen slipped from her fingers twice before she managed to complete her documentation. Dr. Sarah Chen, the hospital psychiatrist, appeared at her elbow with a cup of coffee. "You look exhausted," Sarah observed, her voice carrying the kind of professional concern that Sophia had learned to deflect. "Just tired. The pregnancy makes everything more difficult." The lie came easily now, polished smooth by months of practice. But Sarah's expression remained thoughtful. "Sophia, I've been wondering about those vitamins your husband mentioned during your last hospital visit. What exactly are you taking?" The question hit like ice water. James had visited her at work exactly once, bringing flowers and playing the devoted husband while mentioning casually that he made sure Sophia took all her pregnancy vitamins religiously. She hadn't realized anyone was listening closely enough to remember. "Just standard prenatal supplements," Sophia replied. But something in Sarah's eyes suggested the psychiatrist wasn't buying the casual dismissal. The reason I ask is that some supplements can interact with stress hormones, especially during pregnancy. If you're experiencing any unusual symptoms, dizziness, memory issues, emotional numbness, it might be worth reviewing everything you're taking. Emotional numbness. The words hit home with devastating accuracy. When was the last time she had felt anything clearly? When had her emotions become so muted, so distant that evening? Sophia sat at her vanity removing her makeup while James worked in his study. She stared at her reflection, trying to remember the last time she had felt truly present in her own life. The face looking back at her was beautiful, pampered, perfectly maintained. It was also completely hollow. From James's study came the sound of a heated phone conversation, his voice carrying the edge it took on when business wasn't going according to plan. She heard fragments through the partially closed door. Something about regulatory investigations, about senators asking uncomfortable questions about data privacy. "I don't care what it costs," James was saying, his voice sharp with frustration. "Make the problem disappear. That's what I pay you for." Sophia finished her skincare routine and climbed into bed, but sleep wouldn't come. She lay in the darkness, listening to James pace in his study, his voice rising and falling with whatever crisis demanded his attention. The baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing her anxiety. Around midnight, she heard James's footsteps approaching their bedroom. He entered quietly, probably assuming she was asleep. But instead of coming to bed, he went to her purse and removed something small. In the dim light from the hallway, she watched him examine what looked like a pill bottle before replacing it carefully. When he finally slid into bed beside her, Sophia kept her breathing even and deep, feigning sleep. His hand settled on her pregnant belly, a gesture that might have been tender if she hadn't felt the calculating way his fingers moved, as if he were taking inventory of his property. "Sleep well, darling," he whispered against her ear. "Tomorrow's going to be a big day." She had no idea what he meant, but the tone sent chills down her spine. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to their penthouse. Marcus Whitmore, James's identical twin brother, stood in their foyer looking like a darker mirror image of her husband. Where James was polished and controlled, Marcus appeared disheveled, his expensive clothes wrinkled, his eyes carrying a wild intensity that made Sophia instinctively step back. "I need to talk to you," Marcus said without preamble, his gaze fixed on Sophia with disturbing focus. "Alone." James materialized from his study, his expression shifting from surprise to something harder. "Marcus, what an unexpected pleasure." The tension between the twins was immediate and electric. They looked identical, but felt completely different, like opposing forces contained in matching bodies. "I need to speak with your wife," Marcus repeated, his voice carrying an undertone of barely controlled desperation. "About what, exactly?" James asked, moving protectively between Marcus and Sophia. "About things she needs to know. About you." The words hung in the air like a threat. Sophia felt something shift in the dynamic of the room, as if pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed were suddenly clicking into place. "I think you should leave," James said, his voice deadly calm. But Marcus stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Sophia's face. "Ask him about Father's accident. Sophia, ask him about the night the old man supposedly fell down those stairs." "That's enough." James's hand moved to his phone, but Marcus continued speaking, his words tumbling out in a rush. "Ask him about Rebecca and Jennifer. Ask him what really happened to the wives before you." Wives, plural. The word echoed in Sophia's mind as James escorted his brother firmly to the door, their voices dropping to heated whispers she couldn't quite hear. But she had heard enough. She had never been James's first wife. She had been married to a man whose previous wives had apparently suffered mysterious accidents. As the door closed behind Marcus, James returned to the living room with his practiced smile firmly in place. "I'm sorry about that, darling. Marcus has been struggling with addiction issues. He sometimes says things that don't make sense." But Sophia was remembering fragments now. James's brief, dismissive mentions of a starter marriage that had ended amicably, his casual references to learning from past relationship mistakes, details she had accepted without question during their whirlwind courtship. "Who are Rebecca and Jennifer?" she asked quietly. James's smile never wavered, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Old friends of Marcus's. He sometimes confuses his relationships with mine when he's using—" He moved closer, his hand reaching for her face in what looked like a gentle gesture. "You know, you're the only woman who's ever mattered to me." The lie was perfectly delivered, wrapped in just enough truth to be believable. But Sophia had spent years reading patients' vital signs, learning to recognize when bodies betrayed the stories people told. And right now, every instinct she possessed was screaming that James was lying. As he kissed her forehead and returned to his study, Sophia remained frozen in the living room, one hand on her pregnant belly, the other pressed to her mouth as if to keep more questions from spilling out. For the first time in months, she felt fully awake and terrified. Sophia waited 3 days before acting on the information Marcus had given her. 3 days of pretending nothing had changed while her mind raced with possibilities and fears. On Thursday morning, after James left for his office, she made her first move toward the truth. The Whitmore family lawyer, Edmund Hartley, had handled James's affairs for 30 years. If anyone knew about previous marriages, it would be him. Sophia used her credentials as James's wife to schedule an appointment under the pretense of updating her will before the baby's arrival. Hartley's office occupied an entire floor of a midtown skyscraper, all mahogany and leather and old money respectability. The elderly lawyer greeted her with the kind of deference reserved for billionaires' wives, but Sophia caught something else in his expression. Wariness, perhaps, or pity. "Mrs. Whitmore, how can I assist you today?" Hartley settled behind his massive desk, his fingers steepled in a gesture that reminded her uncomfortably of James. "I wanted to discuss updating my will, but I also had some questions about James's previous legal arrangements." Sophia kept her voice light, curious rather than suspicious. "For family planning purposes." Something shifted in Hartley's expression. "I'm not sure I understand." "His first marriage, I know it was brief, but I wanted to make sure there weren't any legal complications that might affect our child's inheritance." The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Hartley removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate slowness, clearly buying time to formulate his response. "Mrs. Whitmore, I think perhaps you should discuss family history matters with your husband directly." The evasion confirmed her suspicions. There were legal complications, or at least legal secrets that made the lawyer uncomfortable. "Of course," Sophia agreed pleasantly. "But since I'm here, could you just confirm that Rebecca and Jennifer's settlements won't affect our estate planning?" Hartley went very still. "I think this conversation should end here." "Why are there confidentiality issues I should know about, Mrs. Whitmore?" Hartley's voice carried a warning now. "Some matters are better left undisturbed." The meeting ended abruptly, but Sophia had learned what she needed. Rebecca and Jennifer weren't just names Marcus had invented. They were real women with real legal settlements that made James's lawyer nervous. That afternoon, she used her hospital computer to conduct research that felt like performing surgery on her own life. Public records searches turned up fragments of information. A Rebecca Whitmore, who had died in a skiing accident in Aspen 3 years earlier. A Jennifer Whitmore whose death certificate listed cause of death as accidental drowning. 2 women, 2 accidents, 2 previous misses. Whitmores who had died under circumstances that warranted legal settlements. Sophia's hands shook as she printed the death certificates, hiding them in her medical bag between patient files. The tremor wasn't from whatever James had been giving her to keep her compliant. This was pure, rational terror. She thought about the stairs in their penthouse, how easy it would be for a pregnant woman to lose her balance, about the infinity pool on their terrace, how accidents could happen to women who couldn't swim well, about all the ways a wealthy man could arrange for his pregnant wife to suffer an unfortunate incident that would leave him free to find the next Mrs. Whitmore. That evening, James returned home in an unusually good mood, bringing flowers and expensive chocolate. He kissed her with genuine warmth, his hands gentle on her swollen belly, as he spoke to their unborn daughter about the nursery preparations. "I have wonderful news," he announced over dinner. "I've arranged for us to spend the last month of your pregnancy at the house in the Hamptons. Complete peace and quiet. Private medical staff. Just the 2 of us preparing for Emma's arrival. The Hamptons house, isolated, private, with no neighbors close enough to hear anything that might happen. No hospital colleagues to notice if she disappeared for a few days. No witnesses if she suffered an unfortunate accident during her final month of pregnancy." "That sounds wonderful," Sophia managed, her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her throat. "But I'd prefer to stay close to the hospital in case of complications." "Nonsense." James's tone remained pleasant, but she caught the steel beneath. "Dr. Kellerman has already agreed to the arrangement. Everything's been handled." Of course it had. Dr. Kellerman, whose practice depended on James's financial support, would agree to anything James suggested. "When do we leave?" she asked, though she was already planning how to avoid that isolated house where Rebecca and Jennifer's fates might be waiting for her. "Next week. I want everything perfect for Emma's arrival." Perfect. James's favorite word, and the one that terrified her most. After dinner, as James retreated to his study for business calls, Sophia made her decision. She couldn't wait for more evidence or better timing. She had to disappear before next week, before the Hamptons house became her prison. But first, she needed to know exactly what she was running from, late that night, while James slept. Sophia crept into his study and began her search. His computer was password protected, but she knew his patterns well enough to guess correctly on the 3rd try. Emma's due date, reversed. What she found in his private files made her stomach turn. Detailed financial records showed payments to private investigators, payments that corresponded exactly with the dates of Rebecca and Jennifer's deaths. Insurance policies worth millions on both women, policies that had paid out after their convenient accidents. There were other files too. Psychological profiles, medication records, detailed plans for isolating wives from their families and friends. James hadn't just killed his previous wives. He had systematically broken them down first, the same way he was breaking her down now. The white pills he'd been giving her weren't vitamins. They were sedatives, carefully calibrated to keep her compliant and confused. The tremors, the emotional numbness, the difficulty concentrating. All of it was chemical control designed to make her helpless. In a folder labeled Emma, she found the most chilling documents of all: custody arrangements that would take effect if something happened to her, financial provisions for raising their daughter. James wasn't just planning her death. He was planning their daughter's future as an orphan under his complete control. Sophia printed everything she could, her hands shaking so badly she could barely operate the machine. But as she gathered the evidence, she heard footsteps in the hallway. James appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable in the dim light from his computer screen. Having trouble sleeping, darling? She turned slowly, the printed pages clutched against her chest like armor that would never be enough to protect her. Just looking up information about newborn care, she lied, but they both knew he could see the truth in her eyes. James stepped into the study and closed the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a death sentence. "I think," he said quietly, "it's time we had an honest conversation about our future together." The locked study door stood between Sophia and any chance of escape. James moved with predatory calm, his expensive pajamas and perfectly groomed appearance making the threat feel surreal. This was still her husband, the man who brought her flowers and spoke lovingly to their unborn daughter. Except now she understood that the man she'd married was as fictional as the perfect life he'd constructed around them. "You've been busy tonight," James observed, his eyes taking in the scattered papers she clutched against her chest. "I'm impressed. Most women take much longer to piece it together." Most women. The casual plural made her blood freeze. "James, I can explain, no need." He settled into his leather chair, completely relaxed, as if they were discussing dinner plans rather than murder. "I've been wondering when you'd stop taking those vitamins I provided." The clarity must have been quite a shock after months of fog. Sophia's mind raced, calculating distances to the door, to the windows, to anything that might represent safety. But James was between her and every exit, and 8 months of pregnancy made her clumsy, slow. Rebecca figured it out around this stage too. James continued conversationally. Jennifer was actually a bit slower. The medication affected her more severely. But you're different. Medical training, I suppose. Harder to keep sedated without raising suspicions. "The skiing accident," Sophia whispered, "wasn't an accident. No. Though it took some creativity to arrange. Rebecca had grown quite troublesome by the end, threatening to leave me. Take the baby. I couldn't allow that." The casual admission of murder hung in the air between them. Sophia felt Emma shift restlessly inside her, as if the baby could sense the danger surrounding them both. What about Jennifer? Drowning. Much simpler. Really. Jennifer never learned to swim properly, despite all those expensive lessons. Tragic, really. Falling into the pool during her morning walk, especially so close to her due date. The pattern was becoming clear. James married women, got them pregnant, then eliminated them before the children were born. But why? What was the purpose? "I can see you trying to work it out," James said, reading her expression with disturbing accuracy. "The insurance money is just a bonus. You understand. The real benefit is the sympathy. The grieving widower, raising his children alone, honoring his late wife's memory through charitable donations and public appearances. It's remarkably effective for building both social capital and business relationships." "That's sick. That's practical." James's voice hardened. "Do you have any idea how much business I've generated through tragedy? How many government contracts I've secured because senators felt sorry for the poor billionaire who'd lost so much? Rebecca and Jennifer's deaths were the foundation of my current success." Sophia realized with growing horror that she wasn't just married to a serial killer. She was married to a man who had turned murdering wives into a business strategy. "Emma," she whispered, her hands moving protectively to her belly. "We'll be raised with the finest nannies and education money can provide," James assured her. "I'm not a monster, Sophia. I'm simply a man who understands that sometimes personal sacrifices must be made for the greater good." "The greater good of your bank account." "The greater good of building an empire that will last generations." Emma will inherit billions, all built on the foundation of her mother's noble sacrifice. The words were delivered with such calm conviction that Sophia realized James genuinely believed his own justifications. In his mind, he wasn't a murderer. He was a strategic planner making necessary business decisions. "What if I agreed to divorce you quietly?" she asked desperately. "Take nothing, disappear, let you keep Emma." James shook his head sadly. "I'm afraid it's too late for that, darling. You've seen too much, know too much. And frankly, the grieving widower story is much more compelling than the abandoned husband narrative. Someone will investigate. When I disappear, you won't disappear. You'll die tragically in our Hampton house next week, probably from complications related to your pregnancy. Dr. Kellerman will be devastated that he couldn't save you both, despite his heroic efforts. Both. James was planning to kill Emma too, then claim both mother and baby had died from pregnancy complications. The perfect tragedy to generate maximum sympathy and minimal investigation. People will ask questions. My colleagues will remember how devoted I was to your care, how I insisted on the best medical attention, how I'd moved heaven and earth to save you. James stood and moved closer. I've been perfecting this approach for years, Sophia. Every detail has been considered. She backed away until her shoulders hit the bookshelf, trapped between leather-bound volumes and her husband's casual discussion of infanticide. The beauty of the system, James continued, is that grief makes people incurious. When a wealthy man loses his pregnant wife in a medical emergency, society rallies around him. Questions feel heartless. Investigations seem unnecessary. Marcus knows, Sophia said desperately. He'll tell people. James laughed, a sound completely devoid of warmth. Marcus knows nothing useful. My dear brother has been in and out of psychiatric facilities for the past 5 years. His credibility is somewhat limited. Another piece clicked into place. You had him committed. I had him treated for his obvious mental health issues. The fact that his treatment keeps him from interfering in family business is merely a convenient side effect. Sophia understood now that James's control extended far beyond his wives. He had systematically eliminated every person who might threaten his carefully constructed narrative. Marcus, the lawyers, the doctors, everyone who might ask inconvenient questions had been bought, threatened, or discredited. You can't possibly think you'll get away with this forever, she said, though her voice carried no conviction. I've gotten away with it perfectly so far, and each success makes the next one easier. People see what they expect to see. Sophia, they expect grieving widowers to be tragic figures deserving sympathy, not murder suspects deserving investigation. James moved closer, and Sophia caught the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with something else, something clinical and cold. I want you to know that I did care for you, in my way, he said, his voice taking on a tone that might have been gentle if she didn't know what he was planning. You were intelligent, beautiful, accomplished. Under different circumstances, things might have been different. What circumstances? If you hadn't been so curious, if you'd been content to take your medication and play your role, if you'd been willing to die quietly when the time came. The casual mention of her death as a scheduling issue made Sophia's knees weak. She was going to die next week, probably in a staged medical emergency that would leave no traces and generate no suspicions. Emma would die with her, and James would use their deaths to build his empire higher, unless she could find a way to stop him. I need to use the bathroom, she said suddenly. James smiled. Of course, but I think we'll stay together from now on, for your safety. You understand. Safety. The word felt like mockery, But Sophia nodded and allowed James to escort her from the study. As they walked through their penthouse, she memorized details with desperate intensity: the distance to the front door, the location of potential weapons, the security cameras that might record whatever happened next. But mostly, she focused on the feeling of Emma moving inside her. Her daughter was still alive, still fighting. And as long as they were both breathing, there was still hope. She just had to survive long enough to find it. Morning came with the illusion of normalcy. James prepared coffee and croissants as if he hadn't spent the previous night casually discussing murder. He kissed Sophia's forehead before leaving for the office, reminded her about their Hampton House departure in 3 days, and promised to pick up the special prenatal vitamins Dr. Kellerman had recommended. The vitamins that would probably ensure she was too sedated to resist whatever he had planned. Sophia waited exactly 30 minutes after James left before beginning her escape preparations. She had no illusions about her chances. A woman 8 months pregnant couldn't simply disappear, especially not from someone with James's resources and connections. But she had to try. First, she gathered the evidence she'd printed the night before, sealing it in a waterproof envelope along with a detailed letter explaining everything she'd discovered. If something happened to her, maybe someone would eventually find the truth. Next, she packed a small bag with essentials, cash she'd been secretly gathering from household expenses, her medical credentials, phone chargers, and the few items of sentimental value she couldn't bear to leave behind. Her mother's engagement ring, hidden since the wedding because James preferred she wear only jewelry he'd chosen. The most crucial preparation was medical. Sophia used her hospital access to research safe houses for domestic violence victims, memorizing addresses and phone numbers since she couldn't risk written records James might find. She also researched the signs of preterm labor, knowing that stress and fear might trigger early delivery. By noon, she felt ready to make her move. The plan was simple: take a taxi to Manhattan Presbyterian, claim she was experiencing pregnancy complications, and once safely in the hospital, contact domestic violence advocates who could help her disappear. But as she reached for her purse, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, Sophia saw Marcus standing in the hallway, looking even more disheveled than during his previous visit. His eyes were wild, darting nervously as if he expected James to appear at any moment. She opened the door, cautiously. "Marcus, what are you doing here?" "I know you found out," he said, without preamble, pushing past her into the penthouse. "I can see it in your face. You know what he's planning." The desperation in his voice made her step back. "How could you possibly know?" "Because I've been watching, waiting for the right moment to help you." Marcus moved to the windows, peering down at the street as if checking for surveillance. "We don't have much time. James has people watching you now." "What people?" "Private security. They look like random pedestrians, but they're his employees. He's done this before." Sophia. The monitoring. The isolation. The final trip to a remote location. Sophia felt the weight of invisible eyes watching from the street below. How long had she been under surveillance without knowing it? "You have to listen to me," Marcus continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I have proof about what happened to Rebecca and Jennifer. Financial records, witness statements, everything you need to put James away forever." For the first time since discovering James's files, Sophia felt a flicker of hope. "You have evidence hidden where James will never find it, but we have to move fast. Once he realizes you know the truth, he'll accelerate his timeline." Marcus pulled out a cell phone, different from the one he'd had during his previous visit. "This is a secure line, untraceable. I've already contacted people who can help us." "What kind of people?" "Federal investigators. They've been building a case against James for months, waiting for someone with inside access to come forward. The words hit Sophia like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. Federal investigators meant resources that could match James's protection that went beyond local police departments he might have influenced. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because I needed you to discover the truth yourself. If I just told you, you might not have believed me. James is very convincing when he wants to be. That was undeniably true. Even now, part of Sophia's mind wondered if she was overreacting, if there might be innocent explanations for everything she'd found. "Show me the evidence," she said. Marcus nodded and led her to James's study. "It's hidden in here." James thinks he's so smart, but he never suspected his own brother might be documenting his crimes. As Marcus began searching through James's files, Sophia felt the first flutter of suspicion. How did Marcus know exactly where to look? Why did he have such easy access to James's private documents? "Here," Marcus said, pulling out a folder she hadn't seen the night before. Copies of all the insurance policies, communications with the investigators who staged the accidents, everything. But as Sophia opened the folder, her blood turned to ice. The documents inside weren't evidence of James's crimes. They were detailed psychiatric evaluations, all bearing Marcus's name, reports describing paranoid delusions, violent fantasies, and recommendations for long-term institutionalization. "Marcus," she said carefully. "What is this?" When she looked up, she saw that Marcus's expression had changed completely. The desperate fear was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating, something that looked disturbingly familiar. "You're very smart, Sophia," he said, his voice taking on a tone she recognized. Smarter than Rebecca or Jennifer, but not quite smart enough. The truth hit her like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't James's troubled twin brother. Marcus was James, playing another role in his elaborate manipulation. The man she'd been married to for 18 months had been pretending to be two different people. "There is no Marcus," she whispered. "Oh, there was. My dear brother died in a car accident 5 years ago. Tragic, really. But his identity has proven quite useful for certain situations." Sophia backed toward the door, but James moved to block her path. The man who had been playing Marcus was faster, more agile than the controlled businessman she thought she knew. "You see, darling, sometimes it's necessary to approach problems from multiple angles. You were too suspicious of your devoted husband, but quite willing to trust his desperate brother. The psychiatric records are genuine. Marcus really was mentally ill before his death. Paranoid delusions about me trying to kill him. Rather ironic, since I actually was." The casual admission of fratricide added a new dimension to James's monstrosity. He hadn't just killed wives for profit. He had murdered his own twin brother and stolen his identity. "How long have you been playing both roles?" "Since before we met. It was Marcus who first approached you at that medical conference. Remember the charming conversation about trauma surgery techniques? But it was James who asked you to dinner." Sophia's mind reeled as she remembered their courtship differently. The push-pull dynamic that had felt like two different men pursuing her, because that's exactly what it had been. One man, two identities, playing an elaborate game designed to make her fall in love with a fantasy. Everything was a lie. Everything was a performance, and you played your part beautifully until last night. James reached into his jacket and pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid. "This will make everything easier. For both of us." "What is it?" "Something to help you relax while we take our trip to the Hamptons. Originally, I'd planned to wait until next week, but circumstances have changed." Sophia realized with dawning horror that her escape window had just slammed shut. James wasn't going to wait for his carefully planned timeline. He was going to kill her today and use the Marcus identity to provide himself with an alibi. People will ask questions when I disappear. Marcus will be devastated by his sister-in-law's tragic death. He'll provide such detailed testimony about James's grief, about how devoted James was to his pregnant wife. 2 witnesses instead of 1 makes the story much more convincing. The syringe moved closer, and Sophia pressed her hands to her pregnant belly, feeling Emma respond to her elevated heart rate with worried movement. "Please," she whispered, "don't hurt the baby." "I won't hurt her," James promised it. "The injection will simply ensure you both sleep peacefully through what comes next." Sophia looked into the eyes of the man she'd married and saw nothing that resembled love, compassion, or even basic humanity. James Whitmore was a predator who had turned murder into an art form, and she was about to become his masterpiece. But Emma was still moving, still fighting for life inside her, and Sophia wasn't ready to give up. Sophia's hand closed around the heavy crystal paperweight on James's desk just as the syringe moved toward her arm. Without thinking, she swung it with all the strength desperation could provide. The impact against James's temple sent him staggering backward, the syringe flying across the room to shatter against the wall. "You bitch," he snarled, his perfect facade cracking completely as blood trickled down his face. Sophia ran. Through the penthouse, her pregnant belly making her clumsy but adrenaline driving her forward. Behind her, James was shouting, his voice carrying rage she'd never heard before. She reached the front door and yanked it open, stumbling into the hallway as the elevator doors opened to reveal Detective Rivera. "Dr. Martinez?" Rivera's experienced eyes took in Sophia's disheveled appearance, the terror in her face, the sounds of destruction from behind her. "Are you all right?" "He's trying to kill me," Sophia gasped. "My husband killed his other wives and plans to kill me and the baby." "Slow down," Rivera said, her hand moving instinctively to her weapon as James appeared in the doorway, blood still seeping from his temple. "Detective Rivera," James said, instantly transforming back into the concerned husband. "Thank goodness you're here. My wife is having some kind of breakdown. She's been acting erratically for weeks, and now she's become violent." "That's not true," Sophia protested, but uncertainty flickered in Rivera's eyes. "She struck me with a paperweight," James continued, touching his head. "I'm worried about her mental state, especially this close to delivery. Pregnancy can cause severe psychological disturbances." Rivera looked between them, clearly trying to assess the situation. To an outside observer, Sophia realized she must look unstable, disheveled, pregnant, making wild accusations against a man who appeared calm despite being injured. "Mrs. Whitmore, why don't we go inside and discuss this calmly?" Rivera suggested. "No," Sophia said quickly. "I'm not going back in there." "See what I mean?" James said sadly. "She's been paranoid for weeks. I think the pregnancy stress has triggered some kind of psychotic episode." Rivera's expression shifted slightly toward suspicion of Sophia rather than James. "Detective, please," Sophia said, forcing calm into her voice. "I have evidence, documents proving he killed his previous wives." "Previous wives." Rivera's eyebrows rose. "I was married once before, very briefly, years ago," James explained smoothly. "The marriage ended in divorce. There was no death involved." "I can show you the documents," Sophia insisted. "Of course," James agreed readily. "Please come in and see what Sophia's been obsessing over." As they entered the penthouse, Sophia felt the trap closing. James led them to his study, where her evidence was scattered across his desk, But as Rivera examined the papers, Sophia saw James's strategy unfolding. These appear to be insurance documents and death certificates, Rivera observed. Exactly, James said. Sophia has been researching random deaths of women with similar names, convincing herself they were my previous wives. Rebecca was a distant cousin I never met, but Sophia became convinced she was my secret first wife. The explanation was plausible enough to plant doubt. Without context, the documents could look like paranoid obsessions rather than evidence of murder. What about Jennifer Whitmore? Another distant relative. Sophia has been collecting death certificates of women who share my surname, then weaving them into elaborate fantasy about my murderous past. Sophia watched in horror as her evidence was transformed into proof of her own instability. Mrs. Whitmore, Rivera said gently, pregnancy can cause significant stress and anxiety. Sometimes that manifests as paranoid thoughts. I'm not paranoid, Sophia said desperately. He admitted it to me last night. He told me he killed them both. Sophia, James said with perfect concern. We don't have a house in the Hamptons. We've never owned property there. The statement hit like a sledgehammer. She had never actually seen the Hampton house James had described. What if there was no Hampton house? What if that had been manipulation designed to make her sound delusional? The house, she whispered. There is no house, darling, James said gently. That's another one of your fantasies. Rivera was looking at Sophia with growing concern rather than belief. A pregnant woman claiming her husband planned to kill her at a non-existent house, based on evidence that looked like paranoid research. I think my wife needs professional help, James said. This pregnancy has been difficult, and I'm worried about her mental health. I'd like to have her evaluated by a psychiatrist, James continued, for her safety and the baby's. The words sent ice through Sophia's veins. Psychiatric evaluation meant hospitalization, medication, loss of control. It meant James could have her declared mentally incompetent. That might be advisable, Rivera agreed. Mrs. Whitmore, would you be willing to speak with a mental health professional? I'm not crazy, Sophia said, but her voice carried the desperate edge that made her sound exactly like someone having a breakdown. Of course you're not crazy, James said soothingly. You're just stressed and confused. Professional help will sort everything out. Sophia realized this had been James's plan all along, not to kill her immediately, but to have her declared mentally incompetent first. Once committed to psychiatric care, he could control her treatment, medications, access to the outside world, keep her alive but helpless until after Emma was born, then arrange for both to die in a medical accident no one would question. I want to go to the hospital, Sophia said suddenly. Manhattan Presbyterian, for pregnancy complications. It was desperate, but the hospital was the only place she might find allies. Of course, James agreed immediately. Detective Rivera, would you mind accompanying us? I want to ensure Sophia receives proper care. As they prepared to leave, Sophia caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. She looked exactly like what James claimed a disheveled, paranoid pregnant woman having a mental health crisis. The trap was perfect. James had spent months positioning himself as the concerned husband while undermining her credibility. Now, when she needed someone to believe her most, she sounded exactly like what he'd prepared people to expect. As they rode toward the hospital, Sophia pressed her hands to her belly and whispered to Emma, I'm not giving up. I'm going to find a way to save us both. But for the first time since discovering James's true nature, she wasn't sure she believed her own promise. Manhattan Presbyterian felt foreign despite being Sophia's workplace for 3 years. Dr. Sarah Chen met them in the psychiatric consultation room, her expression professionally neutral but wary. Sophia, Sarah said gently. I understand you've been having concerning thoughts about your husband. The phrasing sent chills down Sophia's spine. Concerning thoughts, not legitimate fears. They're facts. Sarah, James has killed 2 previous wives and plans to kill me next. Sarah made notes, clinical detachment making Sophia feel like a specimen. Tell me about these previous wives. As Sophia explained about Rebecca and Jennifer, the death certificates and insurance policies, Sarah's expression grew more concerned rather than convinced. Have you been experiencing anxiety, depression, difficulty concentrating? Yes, because he's been drugging me. Sophia pulled out the white pills. These aren't vitamins. They're sedatives. Sarah examined the bottle, then looked up with an expression that made Sophia's stomach drop. These are standard prenatal vitamins, Sophia, the same ones we recommend to all pregnant patients. That's impossible. Pregnancy can cause those symptoms naturally. Hormonal changes affect cognitive function and emotional regulation. Sophia stared in disbelief. If these were ordinary vitamins, then everything she'd attributed to drugging was her own mind betraying her. James admitted everything last night. He told me he killed Rebecca and Jennifer. Sophia, James interjected softly. I never said that. You've been having nightmares for weeks. Last night you woke up screaming about murderers. I think you confused a dream with reality. Even Sophia began doubting her own memories. Had the study conversation really happened, or been a vivid nightmare from stress and pregnancy hormones? The documents in his study, random death certificates you printed from the internet, James replied. Insurance documents that have nothing to do with me. Sarah looked at Sophia with growing concern. Have you been having trouble distinguishing dreams from reality? I'm not hallucinating, Sophia insisted. But doubt crept in. Pregnancy brain was real. What if James was right? What if her stress had created an elaborate paranoid fantasy? I'd like to keep you for observation, Sarah said, until we stabilize your anxiety and ensure the baby's health. Observation meant psychiatric hold, medication, loss of autonomy, James controlling her treatment, shaping the narrative about her mental state. I want to go home. That's not advisable. You're experiencing significant psychological distress. See, James said with loving concern. Dr. Chen knows how to help us. Us, as if they were still a team, as if her certainty that he was trying to kill her was just another symptom to manage. Let me go to my mother's house, Sophia said quietly. Something flickered in James's eyes. Darling, your mother lives in that tiny Queen's apartment. She doesn't have room for a pregnant woman needing medical supervision, and given her anxiety history, she's not the best influence. Another perfectly reasonable statement making Sophia sound unstable. When had James learned to anticipate her every move? When had he become so skilled at making her doubt her own perceptions? Admission for observation is the right choice. Sarah concluded. We'll monitor the baby and adjust your medication. What medication? Something mild to stabilize your mood. Nothing harmful to the baby. I refuse treatment. Mrs. Whitmore, you're not in position to make medical decisions. Your judgment is impaired. The death sentence. If she wasn't competent for medical decisions, James would become her legal guardian, authorizing any treatment he deemed necessary. Detective Rivera, please don't let them do this. I'm just trying to protect my baby. Rivera looked genuinely sorry but resolved. You need professional help, for both your sakes. As security arrived to escort her to the psychiatric ward, Sophia felt her last hope crumbling. She had played directly into James's hands, confirming everything he'd told people about her mental state. The psychiatric ward felt like prison, despite cheerful colors. As nurses processed her admission, Sophia realized James had achieved something more sophisticated than murder. He'd arranged for her to imprison herself, surrender control of her life and Emma's future. Through her room window, she saw James speaking intensely with Sarah and the administrator, planning her treatment, deciding how long she needed psychiatric care, when she'd be stable enough to return to his tender care. That night, sedatives coursing through her system despite protests, Sophia felt Emma's frantic movements. Her daughter sensed danger despite being surrounded by medical professionals. "I'm sorry," Sophia whispered. "I tried to save us, but made everything worse." For the first time since discovering James's nature, Sophia considered he might win, that she might never leave except under his control, that Emma might be born into a world where her father was a monster and her mother too broken to protect her. As medication pulled her toward unconsciousness, Sophia couldn't see any way to change it. She was trapped in a cage of her own making, and James held the only key. On her third day in the psychiatric ward, Sophia met the woman who would change everything. Her name was listed as Jane Doe on her chart, a patient with no memory of her identity who'd been found wandering near the East River 3 months earlier. But when Jane spoke to Sophia during their group therapy session, her voice carried an educated accent and her eyes held intelligence that didn't match her supposed amnesia. "They told me I had a psychotic break," Jane whispered during their supervised walk in the hospital garden. "Said I was making up stories about my husband trying to kill me." Sophia's blood froze. What kind of stories? That he'd killed his previous wife, that he was planning to stage my death to look like suicide. Jane glanced around to make sure no one was listening. That he used his money and connections to have me committed when I tried to expose him. The parallels were too exact to be coincidental. "What was your husband's name?" "James Whitmore." The words hit Sophia like lightning. Jane wasn't a random psychiatric patient with similar delusions. Jane was Rebecca, the wife James claimed had died in a skiing accident. She was alive, had been alive all along, trapped in the same psychiatric prison that now held Sophia. "That's impossible," Sophia breathed. "He showed me your death certificate." Jane's laugh held no humor. "Easy enough to fake when you own half the judges in the state and employ the best forgers money can buy. James didn't kill me. Sophia, he did something worse. He erased me." The strategy was brilliant and horrifying. Instead of murdering his wives and risking police investigation, James had them declared mentally incompetent and committed indefinitely. They disappeared from society just as effectively as if they died, but without the legal complications that came with corpses and crime scenes. "How long have you been here?" Sophia asked. 3 years. "They've convinced everyone I'm a Jane Doe who suffered severe psychological trauma. No family, no friends, no one looking for me. James visits occasionally, playing the concerned brother-in-law worried about his late wife's disturbed cousin." The depth of James's deception was staggering. He'd created an entirely fictional identity for Rebecca, then used his influence to ensure no one questioned her indefinite detention. "What about Jennifer?" Jane nodded toward another patient, a young woman with hollow eyes who spent her days staring out the window. "Emma Williams, according to her chart, but she whispers her real name sometimes when the medication wears off." Sophia looked at the woman she now knew was Jennifer, James's second wife who had supposedly drowned but was actually trapped in a chemical fog of antipsychotic drugs. 3 wives, all alive, but so thoroughly erased from the world that they might as well be dead. "How many others do you think there are?" Sophia asked. "I've been keeping track. There are at least 2 more women in this facility who match the pattern. Young, educated, wealthy husbands who had them committed for their own protection." Jane's voice carried bitter knowledge. "James isn't the only one using this system. There's a whole network of wealthy men who've discovered that psychiatric commitment is safer than murder. The revelation made Sophia sick. They weren't just victims of one man's twisted psychology. They were casualties in a broader system that allowed rich husbands to dispose of inconvenient wives without legal consequences. "Why haven't you tried to escape?" Jane rolled up her sleeve, revealing track marks from countless injections. "They keep us medicated enough to be compliant, but aware enough to suffer. And even if we could escape, who would believe us? We're legally insane. Remember, our testimony is worthless." Sophia understood the trap completely now. James hadn't just stolen their freedom, he'd stolen their credibility, their legal standing, their very identities. They were ghosts haunting a psychiatric ward while their husband moved on to his next victim. "There has to be a way out," Sophia said. "Maybe," Jane replied, "but it would require someone on the outside who believes us, someone with enough power to challenge the system." That night, Sophia lay awake despite the sedatives they'd given her mind racing through possibilities. She thought about Detective Rivera, who had seemed genuinely concerned but ultimately convinced by James's performance, about Dr. Chen, whose medical judgment had been shaped by James's narrative about Sophia's mental state, but there was someone else, someone James might not have anticipated. Marcus, the real Marcus, whose identity James had stolen. If he was still alive, still confined somewhere in this system, he might be the key to exposing everything. The next morning, Sophia began her careful investigation. During art therapy, she sketched portraits and showed them to other patients, asking if they recognized the face. During group sessions, she listened to stories that might contain clues about other victims. During her supervised phone calls to James, she probed carefully for information about his brother's whereabouts. It took a week, but she finally found him. Marcus Whitmore was 3 floors up in the high-security ward, committed 5 years earlier for violent paranoid delusions about his twin brother. According to his chart, he claimed his brother was trying to kill him and steal his identity. Everything Marcus had told the doctors was true. James had murdered his twin and taken his place, just as he'd erased his wives and taken their lives. Marcus was the one witness who could prove James's real identity, if anyone would listen to him. But reaching Marcus meant getting past security measures designed to keep violent patients isolated. It meant risking her own fragile position in the lower security ward. It meant gambling everything on a plan that might only prove she was as delusional as James claimed. Sophia thought about Emma, growing larger inside her with each passing day, about the life her daughter would have if James succeeded in his plans, about the other women who might fall into his trap if he wasn't stopped. The risk was enormous, but doing nothing guaranteed that James would win. On her 10th day in the psychiatric ward, Sophia began implementing her escape plan. Not escape from the hospital, but escape from the identity James had created for her. She was going to prove that Dr. Sophia Martinez was not a delusional patient, but a competent physician who had discovered evidence of a massive conspiracy. And she was going to use the system's own rules against the men who thought they owned it. The war was far from over, but for the first time since James had trapped her in this nightmare, Sophia felt like she might have weapons that could match his. The key to reaching Marcus came from Jennifer, who whispered crucial information during her brief lucid moments between medication doses. "The orderly, Miguel," Jennifer said quietly. "He knows something's wrong here. His sister disappeared the same way we did." Miguel Santos worked nights in the high-security ward. When Sophia began watching for him during sleepless nights, she noticed he moved differently than other staff, more carefully, as if constantly questioning what he saw. During 3 a.m. medication rounds, Miguel entered her room to check her IV. Instead of pretending to sleep, Sophia sat up. Your sister Maria. She's here, isn't she? Miguel froze. Who told you about Maria? Nobody had to. I can see it in your face. Women who disappeared into the system because powerful men found us inconvenient. Miguel glanced toward the door. You're supposed to be sedated. The medication levels should have you unconscious. I've been pretending to take the pills, just like your sister probably tried to do. The confirmation in Miguel's eyes told Sofia everything. Maria Santos was another victim of the psychiatric disposal system. I need to get a message to Marcus Whitmore on the 5th floor, Sofia said urgently. That's impossible. High-security patients can't receive communications. Then I need to see him myself. Miguel shook his head. What would be the point? Marcus has been here 5 years. Nobody believes him anymore. Because nobody's had corroborating evidence before. Sofia pulled out sketches she'd been making, detailed drawings of James's face and mannerisms. Marcus can confirm the man claiming to be his brother is an impostor. Miguel studied the drawings. These look like the man visiting Maria. Claims to be her concerned brother-in-law. Another piece clicked. James wasn't just disposing of wives, he was building a network of victims, each providing cover for the other's disappearances. How many women? Sofia asked. At least 6 that I know of. All young, educated, committed by wealthy family members. All forgotten. The conspiracy was massive, but it also represented opportunity. 6 women with similar stories would be harder to dismiss. I need you to help me document everything, Sofia said, and get word to Detective Rivera that I have new evidence. Miguel brought a digital camera and access cards the next night. I've been documenting irregularities for months, he admitted. Patient records that don't match intake reports, visitors not listed as family contacts, medications not approved for pregnant patients. Pregnant patients. There are others. 3. All committed during their 3rd trimester by concerned husbands. The pattern was specific. James and his network targeted pregnant women, using pregnancy vulnerability to make commitment seem reasonable. What happens to the babies? Miguel's expression answered before he spoke. Born here, in the psychiatric facility. Fathers gain immediate custody, citing mother's incapacity. Over 3 nights, they systematically documented the conspiracy. Patient files revealing patterns. Visitor logs showing the same man visiting multiple patients under different identities. Medical records showing pregnant women giving birth in psychiatric custody. On the 4th night, Miguel led Sofia through darkened hallways to the 5th floor. Marcus Whitmore sat by his window, hollow-eyed from 5 years of psychiatric incarceration. You're not supposed to be here, Marcus said, his voice flat from over-medication. I'm Sofia Martinez. I'm married to the man pretending to be you. Marcus's expression sharpened. James. Yes. He told me you were dead, but you discovered his plan, didn't you? I found out about Rebecca. The plan wasn't to kill her, but to erase her, make her disappear completely. And when you tried to expose him, he had you committed. Marcus nodded. He took my identity, my life, my freedom. Now he uses my face to destroy other women. Sofia showed Marcus her evidence. For the first time in 5 years, hope flickered in his eyes. Can you testify to what really happened? Who would believe me I'm a psychiatric patient with violent delusions? You're not paranoid if someone really is destroying your life, Sofia replied. And you won't be alone. 6 of us now. 6 women with the same story. Together, we can prove you were right. As dawn approached, Sofia felt possibility settling around them. They had evidence, witnesses, and a plan. For the first time since James had trapped her, she believed they might expose him. But she also knew James wouldn't surrender his empire without a fight. Men with his resources could be very dangerous when cornered. The final battle was about to begin. This time, Sophia intended to win. 3 days later, Detective Rivera received a call that changed everything. Not from Sophia, who was still confined to the psychiatric ward, but from Miguel Santos, who had compiled enough evidence to fill 3 storage boxes and was ready to risk everything to expose the truth. Rivera arrived at Manhattan Presbyterian expecting another dead-end lead in what had become her most frustrating case. Instead, she found herself face-to-face with a conspiracy so elaborate and horrifying that it challenged everything she thought she knew about how justice worked in New York City. 6 women, Miguel explained, spreading patient files across the hospital's conference table. All committed by wealthy husbands within the past 5 years. All pregnant at the time of commitment. All delivered their babies in psychiatric custody before losing parental rights. Rivera studied the documents with growing amazement and rage. The pattern was undeniable once someone took the time to look for it, but it had been hidden in plain sight by the very system designed to protect vulnerable patients. And you believe they're all victims of the same man. Not the same man. The same system. James Whitmore is just one player in a network of wealthy men who've discovered that psychiatric commitment is easier and safer than divorce or murder. Miguel led Rivera through the evidence methodically. Financial records showing payments to psychiatrists, judges, and hospital administrators. Visitor logs revealing that the same individuals were visiting multiple unrelated patients. Medical records documenting unnecessary procedures and excessive medication for women whose only crime was threatening their husbands' carefully constructed lives. But the most damning evidence was Marcus Whitmore himself. When Rivera saw the real Marcus face to face, sitting in his bare room on the high-security ward, she understood immediately that everything James had told her about his brother's mental illness was a lie. Marcus was medicated into compliance, not delusional. His paranoid claims about his twin brother had been rational fears about a real threat. He took my identity 5 years ago, Marcus explained with the careful precision of someone who'd been dismissed as crazy for so long that every word mattered. Killed me legally, socially, financially, then used my face and name to commit crimes I'm now blamed for. Rivera had investigated enough domestic violence cases to recognize truth when she heard it, even from someone the system had labeled as unreliable. Marcus's story aligned perfectly with Sophia's claims and the documentary evidence Miguel had gathered. Why hasn't anyone noticed this before? Because it's designed to be invisible, Miguel replied. Rich men disposing of inconvenient wives looks like mental health care. Private psychiatric facilities look like charity. Judges and administrators who benefit from donations don't ask uncomfortable questions. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond James Whitmore. It involved a network of wealthy men, corrupt officials, and complicit medical professionals who had turned psychiatric care into a disposal system for troublesome women. But Rivera also saw the weakness in their seemingly perfect system. They had kept their victims alive, and alive victims could testify. Over the next week, Rivera quietly built a federal case with assistance from FBI investigators who specialized in corruption and conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming once someone with authority began looking for it, but the investigation required careful coordination to avoid alerting the suspects. The breakthrough came when they traced the financial network funding the conspiracy, James's charitable donations to hospitals, campaign contributions to judges, consulting fees paid to psychiatrists. All of it formed a paper trail that proved systematic corruption. On a gray Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Rivera's first visit to the psychiatric ward, federal agents executed simultaneous,